Dear students in EU Kenkyu and EU Kenkyu Nyumon, hello, welcome back. This is the second lecture in our series on the EU and Europe. My name is Till Weber from the German department. Thank you very much for your feedback mails and the very great number of kind comments and constructive comments. I want to respond to you after sending emails individually, now respond to all of you together. I received 40 mails as of today, May 10th, so a few more to come in, I guess. I decided to take up your advice and do a few improvements to the lecture style. I will be using a little bit more Nihongo at key points, just to summarize. That was a good idea. And then I created a table of contents in the beginning that will help to structure the listening. And it's not just listening. Some of you pointed out, have you checked out, I'm talking about this part here now. Oh, sorry. It's the CC closed caption function at YouTube. Here I took a screenshot of the last lecture. If you look at the CC area, this is here at the bottom right corner. If you click that, you can generate English subtitles to me when I'm speaking. And here you can see, here I have an example of those subtitles. They're actually pretty good. They're over 90% accurate, only they can't catch Japanese words. So there you have to rely on your own eyes. Please try CC if you would like to use subtitles. And now let's move on to the areas of your interest, which you mentioned. It's actually quite a lot and very diverse. Here we talked, you talked about social systems, healthcare systems in the European Union. Four people have a keen interest in languages, noting that there are 24 official languages in the EU. And how many languages do Europeans learn in school and in university? And how are languages used in daily life? Tourism was a topic. I tried to reply in kind, and if we have the time, I would like to choose in a later lecture one program. The interesting point in Europe is it's not just one country, but tourist topics stretch across borders. For instance, someone like Mozart, the composer, he lived and worked in 3 countries, in Germany, in Austria, and in Italy. He also traveled to Paris and to other places. So obviously, this is a European topic rather than a national topic for tourism. Then regions, 4 people mentioned how were regions relationships to be managed, support for poor regions, and Basque, the Spanish-French border region was mentioned twice. The euro drew some interest, especially you want to see coins. Yes, usually Miyazato-sensei does that. I hope she finds a way to do it online. I would like to introduce you to the designs of the bills, Satsu, later on, because that's an interesting story as well. A large number, that's 8 people, were interested in history, culture, and geography. Some of you said you have been interested in Europe since you were children and you're a fan of traveling and culture in Europe. Then how did the EU start? And this is here, architecture, literature, history, and heritage. Quite a few people have an interest in that, but also everyday culture in Europe. Culture and the media were mentioned. Spain was mentioned explicitly twice, and Belgium here once. Another significant group of 5 people talked about the courts, the law institutions, and fundamental rights and the separation of powers. That's the hallmark of democracies, that the government and the parliament and the courts need to be independent of each other. if you mix them up, if you give the government too much power, you have North Korea or China pretty soon. Then, people want information about European courts, and two people rather passionately talked about the death penalty, shike. I replied to those two. Basically, the death penalty is completely illegal in Europe. It's abolished. If a country wants to join the European Union, it has to get rid of the death penalty. Most Europeans now really loathe and hate the death penalty. Why should a country be allowed to kill its own citizens? Is just one reason we don't like it. And actually, the EU has a worldwide anti-death penalty initiative. Once a year, they also try to speak to the Japanese government. The Japanese government is not very comfortable, not really interested in this discussion. I noted there is not much of a social discussion in Japan about the death penalty. I wonder what is the reason. Do you know how the death penalty is being performed? What happens? What exactly happens if a person is killed intentionally and in cold blood after a court verdict? There is not much information out in Japan, not even when people are being executed. So if Japan started a more open discussion about this topic, maybe people would become aware of the death penalty as a problem. And then Erasmus was mentioned, I think even twice or three times. People want to do ryugaku, study abroad, the parliament and so on. Yes, we will do a lecture on how the EU works, the parliament and institutions. Then the Brexit was a pretty big topic, and I think we can summarize your interest in one word: why? Why did the British leave? The EU offers so many advantages, but still they left. It probably has to do with the basic conflict between a supranational institution like the EU and a nation like Britain, like Japan, like France, and so on and so forth. The nation, the individual states, have to give up some of their rights and give it to the supranational institution. They have to accept that European judges, who mainly do not come from their own country, can pass a verdict on your government, your country's government, which you have elected through parliament usually, and top national laws. And this conflict was especially strong in Britain. Then women and LGBTI issues, gender issues, protection for minorities, including LGBT members, and also promotion of women to leading positions. That was this part. One of you asked, can the EU be a model for Asian countries? Actually, if we had done this lecture 10 to 15 years earlier, we would have had a big discussion, because then you may remember there was a Prime Minister of Japan, Hatoyama. Juichiro, was that his name? I forgot. Hatoyama Soridaijin suggested an AU, an Asian Union, with South Korea, Taiwan, maybe China, and so on and so forth. It didn't come to anything. And since Hatoyama's days, the conflicts between East Asian countries have only grown stronger, not weaker. Even Japan and South Korea, who share democracy and who share an economic model, have a very bad relationship now. Before we can return to a discussion about something like an Asian Union, Asian countries need to improve their relationships, the relationships with their neighboring countries. Then we have the economics. Also, several of you interested, economic activities, EU and the environment, 環境ですね. That's actually the new European major policy for the next 4 to 5 years. And once Corona is subsiding and the economy can be revitalized also in Europe, the European Commission says we will prefer vitalization strategies that are friendly to the environment, that help us reach our climate goals. Religion, especially, why is it so hard for Turkey to join? Someone noted that Turkey is a majority Muslim country, whereas the European Union is mostly Christian. Right, it's true. But there is more problems about Turkey. It's the lack of democracy in Turkey and the leadership of President Erdogan in Turkey, who is not seen as a true ally and who is not seen as sharing European values of liberty, freedom, diversity, and democracy. Then several people had ideas about the European Union as a whole, balancing states' interests for the common good. That's really difficult to find compromises because not all states naturally have the same interests. Benefits were mentioned. I also want to know about the negative points of the EU. I think we touched upon one, Brexit, why want a country to leave the EU, and we will certainly come up with further problem areas during the course of this lecture series. Corona, I promise we will be doing a Corona special from Europe. Please stay tuned for that. And then we had several other fields of interests. Thank you for your suggestions. We want to take up as many of them as possible. And now on to today's lecture, a short history of Europe and the EU. Part 1, Part 2 will follow next week. Let's go. The table of contents. We will start with here, Europe in the Roman Empire. So we will go back over 2,000 years and have a look at what Europe looked like then. The Greeks and the Romans were called the classical period of European history, and they produced an inheritance for Europe. If we take a look at what actually is Greek and Roman in Europe. Then we move on to the Middle Ages, the Empire of Charlemagne, Karl der Große in German, Carlos Magnos in Spanish. It's the same person all over, a very powerful new emperor who founded a new multinational empire in the year 800. Then we look at what united Europe in those days when communication was so difficult, when people hardly traveled, when there were hardly any central institutions in Europe. What kept Europe together was culture. So let's have a look at medieval culture across Europe. I'll be showing you some beautiful slides along the way. Then we move to the early modern period, right, and also cover the 19th century, when Europe extended across the world. That is when Europe came in contact with almost every country, every region in the world, including Japan, obviously since the 16th century. And in the year around 1900, when colonialism was at its peak, more than half of Europe was a colony, half of the world, sorry, was a colony of European countries. So let's take a look at that. And then, of course, the dark side that was asked for, it happened in the 20th century when World War I and World War II broke out. And that changed Europe's position in the world, but also European countries' relationship among each other dramatically. And when the war ended in Europe, for the next few years, we had destruction, desperation, and eventually the Cold War. Europe around 1950. So we have gotten to a point where the European Union is about to come to life, is not yet alive, it will come. And that will have to do with your homework. Let's go. Europe about 2,300 years ago. Here at the bottom you see the Roman Republic, Roma Kyobakoku. That was not Roma Teikoku yet, Kyobakoku. You see it comprised Italy, then Corsica and Sardinia, and parts of Spain, the Mediterranean coast and islands of Spain. The rest of Europe, if you look at who actually lived in Europe, you have one large group, the Celts, stretching from here, Austria, Swiss, over what's France now, to the British Isles and also to the north of Spain, where the Celts mixed with the Iberians and created a people we call Celt Iberians. Another large group of people is the Germans or Germanics, living in Central and Eastern Europe. Obviously, this is what is Germany now. Then the Slavs. The Slavs are the ancestors of Eastern European people, Russians, Polish, Czech, Bulgarians, and others. In the north, you have the Scandinavians. Those were Germanic. Those are Germanic people as well. So what you do not see here is France, Spain, Britain, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands. None of these modern states existed, not even as an idea. 500 years later, 200 AD, the Roman Empire has grown. It has grown dramatically. It is the biggest empire Europe had seen so far. It comprises all of what's Spain now, all of what's France now, Britain, but not Scotland or Ireland. And if you look, this is Germany now. Only a part of Germany, like this part. This part is part of the Roman Empire, whereas the vast rest here is not Roman Empire. So what did the Greeks and the Romans actually bring to Europe? I mean, if you remember the map, the Romans were everywhere. They built cities, they settled. What did they bring to much of Europe? The Greeks basically invented philosophy, tetsugaku, and theater. The whole idea of theater, butai, is a Greek idea. Tragedy, comedy, all these things are Greek concepts. Then, of course, architecture. And that's not just the Greeks who created the temple, but also the Romans. The Romans built stone-paved streets, the Ishitadami no Michi, and squares, hiroba. The square, the hiroba, is very important in European urban tradition, not in Asian tradition. That's a difference, but European cities always have at least one central square where people gather. That's a Roman idea. Then stadium, like any sports stadium in the oval shape, dates back to Greek concepts. The Greeks also invented the Olympic Games, of course. And the Romans are noted for inventing apartment blocks, danshi jutaku. The Romans built cheap flats to be rented out up to 5-6 stories high. They did that 2,000 years ago. The Romans were also famous. They created much of what is our Western concept and also the Japanese concept, by the way, of law and justice. The word justice comes from Justitia, which was the Roman goddess of justice. Also, political ideas, our political ideas, to a large extent, go back to the Greeks and the Romans. The whole word politics, policy, goes back to a Greek word. Democracy means the people rule of the people. Demos is the people in Greek. Dictatorship or tyranny, that's also that's a Roman concept. Dictator, dictator, was a Roman politician who was elected and named for 6 months to lead the state as a dictator in an emergency, as a crisis. But after 6 months, he would have to step down and should not continue his dictatorship. Then, of course, the idea of having an emperor, that probably was developed twice, right? Once in East Asia in China, but independent of that in the Roman Empire in Europe. I mentioned the Olympic Games in Greece. Then languages, you know, the Romance group of languages. Which ones are they? They're all developed from Latin, the language of the Romans, and they comprise Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, among minor languages, plus a few minor languages. So all these languages have something, or actually a lot in common, especially words, and even languages that belong to a different group, like the Germanic languages, such as German, Dutch, English, Scandinavian languages. Those languages also incorporate a lot of Greek and Roman words which entered the language over time. Also, our entire grammatical system, the word grammar, is a Greek word. The idea that language follows certain rules, that there are linguistics, gengogaku, that's a Greek concept. Architecture, sorry, I mentioned that yet again, but also maths and engineering, water works, water supply are especially Roman concepts. And very nice, wine was invented in the Mediterranean area. The Greeks and the Romans loved it, and they loved it so much that when they moved to France, to Germany, to Britain, they brought wine with them and they started to grow wine. So now you have in every European country that's warm enough, you have a wine culture these days. We move on to the year 500. You see the Roman Empire, it's very odd, it's here now. It's not in Rome, it's not centered on the capital of Rome any longer. No, it has moved to the east. It's the Eastern Roman Empire with what is here in this area, which is the capital, which is was called Byzance in those days, later Constantinople, and today it's called Istanbul and has become the capital of Turkey. So the Roman Empire, so what is mostly European Union countries now, is without the Romans. What has happened? We have to look at this vast area, and further on, in the year 500, masses of German people moved everywhere to Western Europe, also from here to the British Isles, and they moved on even to northern Africa, the Vandals. The reason was that there was pressure in the east coming from Asia, and powerful people putting pressure on the Germanic tribes, which again moved. And once they crossed here the river Rhine, this is the river Rhine, and the river Danube, Donau, once they crossed this, the Roman Empire collapsed. It had become too weak. These people had no common identity. Instead, they were organized in tribes, Zoku. One famous tribe, for instance, was the Burgundians. They built their own small kingdom here, which is eastern France now. And if you study French, you will have heard this region until this day in French. It's called Bourgogne. It's called Burgund in German. This is a hint to what happened 1,500 years ago, when the Romanesque and Celtic inhabitants of what's France now mixed with Germanic people, and so the Eastern French people emerged. This happened to almost all European people. So European people are Ningen Champuru, there's no doubt about it. Then you have the Goths. The word Gothic comes from it. Here Goths and there are Goths. Basically, this is the Eastern Goths and the Western Goths, taking Italy and Spain. More Suevi. Suevi actually come from this area in Germany, Schwaben, Suabia, and they took the name here. But the most important of these, there are actually many more, like Anglo-Saxons. Angles, Danes, and Saxons coming to England. But the most important of those, the most successful, were the Franks. And of course, if you look at the map and read the word Franks, you get an idea. Franks, France, France. That's the roots of the name of the country of France, which is in German, which is called Frankenreich. Franke no teikoku. So here we start to see emerging something that resembles what Europe will become much later. Much later, well, in the year 814, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the new emperor, the first emperor of the Second Empire in Europe, so to say, died. His territories were vast. Basically, this is his territories, and Italy is in it, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, France today. Well, roughly, of course. He had 3 sons. None of his sons were as powerful as he was. So he decided, I will divide my empire among my 3 sons. And so the empire will be 3 kingdoms, and it will be easier for my sons to rule, to govern their smaller kingdom than the big empire. And also they will be busy and not make war against each other to try to get the territories of the other. Of course, you see, this was the name given here, Neustria, Neustrian. This is what is Western France now. You also have the word West Franken, Western Frank people. In the east, you have this area, which is the Eastern Frank, here, Austrasien, Eastern Frank kingdom. And inside there are many tribes which you will remember, which you will recognize today if you study German or German language or German history. Saxony, the Saxons. They now live in this area here, around here, Dresden, Leipzig. They moved at some point. Then Bayern, Bavaria, famous Oktoberfest, Bido Matzli, and so on and so forth. So this is the nature of Germany as a federal state can be guessed here, because you have all these individual tribes, and the Franks, the Franken, are only one tribe among many others, the Thuringians, and there are just countless tribes. The interesting part, well, Neustrian, Western Frank Empire and Eastern Frank Empire survived and continued to develop and eventually became roughly France and Germany. The middle part was given, this one, probably the most difficult part, was given to the youngest son, Lothar. His name, Lothar, it was called Lotharingen for a while. His name survives in the region of Lorraine in France. A bit hard to read. It's more or less in this area. Elsass, slightly up here, Lorraine. That's Lothar's core territory, but it also included Burgundy and Italy and what's the Netherlands and Belgium today. Of course, this didn't last. This part of the Frank Empire broke into different national states later on. So, what were the people of Europe in 814 AD really feeling about? What was their entity? I did a mock entity. Okay, it's a bit of a fantasy, but I tried my best. Please have a look. Let's ask a person in Paris, about what he or she feels she is. What's your identity? Me? I'm a Neustrian, of course. Other Franks live in the east, but we have different kings. So the identity is rather local than transnational. A person in a village on the river Donau, which is probably Bayern or Austria these days. I am from Bavaria. The Franks are related to us, but I have never seen their king or emperor. This is a basic problem of medieval countries, medieval states. There are no means of mass communication. There aren't even pictures. There is no television. There is no radio. There are no newspapers. So the king actually needs to come to you, to your town, to your village, and then you may have a chance to see him. Of course, the king doesn't travel by airplane or train. He's traveling on horseback. So very, very slow. The kings, there were no real capitals in those days, so the kings kept on moving through the countryside to meet as many people as possible. And once people have met the king, the king's authority grow a little stronger, but if he went away, it might just collapse again. And then a person from Barcelona. Of course, I'm a Muslim. I live under the Caliph of Cordoba, and Allah is above us all. Spain, except for the very north, in this period, is a Muslim country. There have been Moors and Arabic people invading it from North Africa, and they built a Muslim country which covered much, or at least a large part of Spain until the end of the Middle Ages. So has the idea of Europe, Europa, died together with the Roman Empire? Is it dead? Well, not really, not entirely. Look at this man. You see a man dressed in very gorgeous clothing with gold and diamonds and with a big sword in his hand, and also a helmet. So he is a fighting man, but with a sword, there's also a symbol for that. He's a judge. He's a law enforcer. He is judging people. And he's kneeling. So this powerful man kneels before another man. And who is the other man? His headgear gives it away. This is called it's called a tiara, which is to this day the headgear of the Roman popes, Romano Papa. And what does the Pope do here? He has a crown, right? With a Christian cross on top. And he is about to put the crown on the head of this man. And this happened in Rome, in the old Roman Empire capital, on Christmas Day in the year 800. So who is the man that's kneeling? He is the emperor, the new emperor Charlemagne, Karl der Große, Carlos Magnus, Carlos the Great. He was born in 747, and we already mentioned he died and then divided his large empire. The picture to the left here is was painted in the late Middle Ages, so many years after he lived, but you see the symbols of power, the crown, which he received from the Pope, so his power is given from God. He has the sword, he is a warrior and a judge, and he has the globe with a cross on it. The globe, this is actually the orb, this is the world, and he rules, he has the world in his hands, which means he rules the world. And of course the world is Christian, or should be Christian, so it has the big cross on it. The interesting part is this picture was painted about 700 years after Charles the Great was made emperor. So things have developed, and you see these two coats of arms, Kamon desu ne, the tate, kishi no tate with the mon painted on it. And do you recognize these two? This is actually the coat of arms of Germany these days. A black eagle on gold ground. This is the symbol of the empire. And here you have a blue field with 3 gold lilies on it. This is the coat of arms of France until the French Revolution. It changed in the 18th century, but before that, this was France. So in this picture, you can see during 700 years, the emperor became more and more powerful, and the idea of different countries in one empire, like Germany, Austria, and on the other side, France, the concept of these countries that still exist today emerged during the Middle Ages. So despite the kings and emperors not being able to have very strong, powerful leadership in all places of their empire, something must have happened. One hint, how did Europe survive and grow together in the Middle Ages despite difficulties? One thing is symbols. There are several. We talked about the sword, the crown, the globe, the orb. Another one is the throne, the throne on which the seat on which the emperor sits. And Charles' throne is actually surviving. It's in Aachen Cathedral, which is in Germany, almost in Belgium. It's at the border. This is his 1,200-year-old seat. You can see there are a few simple stone steps, and then there's a wooden seat. And here the emperor would sit, whereas everybody else would just stand down here. So the emperor is throning, reigning over them. But of course, that's just a piece of wood and a few stones. There is more important factors at work. The knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans needed to be preserved in order to keep Europe alive. How did this European identity survive in the Middle Ages? Well, this is the answer. The preservation of knowledge, of common European knowledge, happened in monasteries. Shudoin desu ne, monastery, cloister desu ne. Here's an example. It's in Senang in France. This is the monastery where monks, Shudoin-san or Ama-san, lived together, lived and worked and prayed together. There are thousands, there were and there still are thousands of monasteries across Europe. There is no European country that has no monastery. So I mentioned the monks worked. They also happened to be the most educated people of their age, because only the church had good schools where people learned reading, writing, Latin, Greek. And how do you learn languages? Of course, you read. So this is here, you have a typical page of a medieval manuscript. This is the text in Latin. It's also painted, beautifully painted. For those who can't read, they can at least look at the pictures. And what did the monks do? They copied these texts. In the beginning, the libraries were very, very small. There were probably just 10 or 20 books in the entire library. There was no printing. Every book had to be copied by hand. Also the parchment, they had no paper like washi paper in Japan. They used pigs and animal skins called parchment. That was very expensive. Still, the monks went on, and you see many pictures. Here you see the monks sitting in a hall, maybe in a hall just like this here, and reading and copying books. Look at him. He's not here. This man, he's not reading the book. He's writing it and he's copying it. Also here, you see the feather, goose keel feather. He's writing, and again. Here, another medieval or early modern image, writing. So the monks copied the valuable books of the Greeks and the Romans, and they copied them again and copied them again and copied them again in Latin and Greek, and they passed on the copies to other monasteries. So these books spread throughout Europe and knowledge spread. Another point, I mean, we have already talked about culture as Christian culture. Frankly, in the Middle Ages, most culture in Europe was Christian. There was not so much secular culture, especially not in the beginning. Also, architecture was dominated by Christian ideas in that the biggest buildings in every city or town or even village always was the church, the main church, the cathedral, Daisedo, the cathedral where people gathered and worshiped God. And you can see here examples from across Europe. It starts with St. Peter in Rome in Italy. This is, of course, the Basilica San Pietro, which is the main cathedral of the Pope. So it's the most important Catholic cathedral in Rome. Then something happened in eastern France, in Chartres, in the 13th century, 14th century. A new style was born, Gothic. Now, architecture techniques had improved, mainly because the monks pointed out to Roman writings about architecture. Vitruvius is a famous author, and that you can apply mathematics to constructing buildings. It doesn't have to be trial and error. Maths will do the job. So they built this. It became possible to build these huge, massive spires. Also here in Spain, and also in Cologne. This is the second biggest cathedral in Europe, Cologne-Köln Cathedral, or in England, in Salisbury, here. The idea is to build the spire as high as possible, to come as close as possible to heaven and to God, of course. So religious thinking put in stone united Europe in the Middle Ages, as long as there was only the Catholic religion until the early 16th century. Everybody shared the same religion and shared similar ideas about architecture, about cathedrals, about books and languages. Of course, this changed after a while. We're moving on to the late 15th through 17th century. Well, maybe, okay, where is it? Sorry, need to go. I'm sorry, just made a mistake. I clicked too early. Please take a look at the graph later on, at the slide later on. In the 16th century, Europe expanded around the globe. You know that. Nambanjin, they traveled in ships around many European countries, traveled around the world. Then there was also the there were religious changes, the Protestant Revolution led by Martin Luther, Shukyo Kakume, and Europe in the 16th, 17th century was more divided than before, than in the Middle Ages. There were national states emerging and only keeping their own interest, and probably the interests of their fellow Catholics and fellow Protestants in mind. We have moved on to the 18th century, Enlightenment. Enlightenment, you see the Japanese term here, and then Revolution. Enlightenment has a name to it. It's the name of Voltaire, the leading French philosopher of enlightenment. He said, superstition sets the whole world in flame. Philosophy quenches the flames. He urged rationalism. Don't believe everything people or even the church tells you. Be scientific. Have a close look at nature. Use your brains. Be rational and move forward. That's a very rational and cold approach in a way. The other side of the equation is embodied by this man, Ludwig van Beethoven, who added the emotional side to the new age. All men will be brothers. We are all the same. Why are some people better than other people? Why are some people who are not elected ruling others? That's a little bit taking it too far with Beethoven, but he added this great feeling of brotherhood of man, man working together, men creating a better country, a better place to live. And this, obviously, these two positions, the rational and the emotional position, led to the French Revolution in 1789, which really changed Europe and made it much more modern. Another aspect of modernization in the 19th century was the industrialization. Kojo kakume desu ne. If you look at the picture of Manchester in central England in the early 19th century, so 200 years ago, you have a beautiful natural landscape in front of you, just beautiful. You see even a couple sitting here quietly. But in the back, the new age has arrived. Have you ever seen so many stacks entotsu in one place? And also pollution is here. You see the dirt, the coal is being burned and the particles are released into the atmosphere. This is for us now at the end of the Industrial Revolution, or way past it. It looks like a nightmare, but in the early 19th century, this of course meant wealth. People could get a much better life by sharing in the wealth created by this. And the leading philosopher of this school of thought was Adam Smith, a British guy, Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations, his famous book. If you study Keizai or Kei, you must read it at some point, sooner or later. Every man is left perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way. So it's 100% wagamama. And to bring both his industry, that's his talents, that's what he means, and capital, his money, into competition with those of any other man. So market economy, in a pretty rough and tough style, was born from the pages of Adam Smith's book. And another changer of the world was colonism. As an example, I gave you only British colonial possessions in the world. Here it says 1897, isn't it? You have this is England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Wales here. And then you see there is no continent without British possessions. Canada, here, much of North America, Canada belongs it. Then you have the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Bermuda, so Caribbean places, lots and lots of them. Here, even closer to Saint Georgia, close to the Antarctic Circle. You have South Africa, Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe today, and so on, so African territories. Of course, the kingdom, or the empire rather, of India and Burma, a key possession of the British. Here, then you move into China, you get to Hong Kong. Sorry. Where am I? No. Here, we get to Hong Kong. Australia and New Zealand are part of the British Empire. So this is just one empire, although it was the biggest of that period. Other countries, or European countries, held different parts of the world. Let's just have a look at Africa. In 1914, you see British, that's red again, Egypt and Sudan, for instance, British. You have French possessions here. This is light green, especially in the northwest of Africa, Morocco, Algeria, prominently among them. You have a few German territories, German East Africa. This is Tanzania these days. Italy has taken in Libya and Somalia and Eritrea. Then Portugal, tiny Portugal held a large territory, much bigger than Portugal in Angola, for instance. Spain has parts of Morocco, Ceuta, that's still Spanish to this day. And if you look at this column, independent, light yellow, there's only two countries in all of Africa that are independent. One is Liberia here, which was founded by former slaves who came back from the United States. The word liberty, freedom, is in the country's name. And then we have the Empire of Ethiopia, the only African empire that managed to stay independent for a while. So much of Africa and much of the world is divided among European countries, but those countries are not friends with each other. They are not really cooperating. They are rivals, like capitalist rivals. They try to dominate the world, dominate trade, make money, colonize and control people. And this led to we can make this short. Here we have the situation in Asia. Again, red Australia here, India, Burma, that's British. There's also Spanish in the Philippines, the French here, the Germans have these islands, and Russia has territories in the north, and so on and so forth. Japan has actually joined the rank of colonial powers. Japan and the United States are the two non-European colonial powers. Japan is taking in Korea and also Taiwan and Ryukyu. And this competition, increasingly fierce and vicious competition, is leading the idea of Europe to a new low and exploded in the First World War. When European countries divided and formed two blocks, one was the Allied or Entente powers, and the others, we call them the Central powers. The major countries here were Russia, France, British Empire, and Italy, later joined by the United States. And the Central powers, the biggest was Germany, then came the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Teikoku, the Ottoman Empire, that's Turko Teikoku desu ne, and tiny Bulgaria was also part of it. And this war was fought with the new technologies which had emerged since the Industrial Revolution. So this was the first war fought with airplanes, warplanes, tanks, very, very large guns, gas, and a raft of other horrible weapons of mass destructions. And you see the number of dead people, dead, wounded, and missing, 22 million on the Allied side here, and 16 million on the Central Powers side. If you add these numbers, it's over 38 million people dead. Let's have a look at the tally in detail. Here we have military and civilian deaths, only deaths, not wounded people. And if you look at the blue color, countries marked in blue lie in Europe, countries marked in red lie outside of Europe. If you look at this, the countries that have the most casualties are all in Europe. Even Turkey is partly in Europe. Countries outside of Europe, the US and here Japan, suffer minor losses compared to this. And it's not just people who die, it's also wealth that's been destructed, cities that are burned down to the ground, factories that are wasted, and so on and so forth. So the First World War, Sekai Daiichi Taisen, is the beginning of the decline of Europe. Europe loses much power. Europeans are killing themselves. Yet it became worse. Actually only 21 years later, World War II, Sekai Daiichi Taisen, broke out. And now you have a slightly different layout of enemies. You have the so-called allies, domain, and the axis blocks facing each other. And Again, you have as leading members, you have the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, France is here, but the United States now make a much bigger contribution here. And on the other side, you have Germany and Japan as main combatants, Italy and smaller Eastern European countries, Finland, even Thailand, join in at some stage. And here you get even more destruction. The number of total dead people now on the Allied side reaches 61 million, whereas on the Axis side, over 12 million people perish. That brings the death toll to over 73,000 people, much more than in World War II. And I also have a breakdown here for you. Again, blue means European country, red means outside of Europe. You see this time it's a true world war. There is more casualties outside Europe, but the biggest toll here, that's the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union loses 24 million people in a war that lasts only 4 years for the Soviet Union. Germany has this number of dead, and Poland, that number includes many civilian casualties, and so on and so forth. So this is the second round of inter-European destruction, if I may interpret it. Europeans fighting again against each other, having a similar result, but this time the destruction on the side of the winners is so huge that actually most European countries could feel that they are losers of this war. France, for instance, it won in the end, but it was occupied by Germany for several years. I think it didn't really feel like a victory during the war, at the end of the war. More like a liberation, perhaps. So we have Europe in 1945 in a horrible state. Actually, World War I, World War II are but two wars the Europeans led against each other. What do you think? How many wars did European countries wage against each other between 1500 and 2000? Any idea? Please guess, and I'll give you the number now. 150. 500 years, 150 wars. One war every 2.5, roughly 2.5 years. Especially Germany and France fought, every generation fought against each other since the 17th, 16th century, really. And in this dark hour, this feeling was born in the dark hour of World War I, that is actually Nie wieder Krieg, Never Again War, by Käthe Kollwitz, who was a women artist, a female artist, who died at the end of World War II in Germany. She took up the pacifist, the peaceful message very, very strongly in her art. And if you're interested in this aspect of European history, visit the Sakima Bijutsukan. I'm sure it will reopen soon in Ginowan. Mr. Sakima has the biggest Käthe Kollwitz collection outside of Europe. Fantastic works, anti-war works, also about Okinawa no Sen in 1945. It's really worth looking, and maybe speak to the museum staff who know a lot about it. So we are approaching the end of our lecture today. Europe after 1945, paying the price. Look at the map of Europe now. It's again a completely new map. We have three colors. We have green color here, like France belongs to it. Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, so much of Western Europe belongs to it. Then we have orange, which is the Soviet Union, Soren desu ne, and also Eastern European countries, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, among others. And we have a small number of lightly colored countries like Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, and Ireland. So what are these countries about? The green, well, let's start with the light countries, light-colored countries. Those 5 countries are neutral countries. They do not belong to a major bloc. The green countries, okay, explain that later. The green countries belong to the Western Bloc, the later founded NATO military alliance, and of course the orange countries belong to the bloc controlled by the Soviet Union. Sir Winston Churchill, the famous British Prime Minister, he coined the phrase of Iron Curtain. 鉄の curtain ですね. It has gone down here. Let's start here. Here it goes down and it separates, sorry, Austria. Austria is actually, it should be here, okay. It separates and going on here, separates the Soviet bloc from the free world. Europe, or half of Europe, is under the control of Moscow, of the Soviet Union now, whereas in the West you have very strong, not just support, but also control of the United States. Here, this is control from the East. So Europe has basically lost its powerful position. Europe will also lose almost all its colonies in the years after 1945. And outside powers like the United States or the Soviet Union, mind you, only 10% or so of the Soviet Union are in Europe. The rest is in Asia. These outside powers now control what happens in Europe. To sum it up, 50年代 Europe ね、Cold War、冷たい戦争と言いますか、it's dominated by the East-West confrontation, and the battle line is right here. It goes right through Europe. The Western Bloc, that's the blue countries here, founded NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance with the United States to defend themselves, and the Soviet Union reacted and founded the Warsaw Pact a few years later, also a military alliance. And then there were a few neutral or non-allied states. We had Finland, we mentioned Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria. Spain under dictator Franco was non-aligned, but that changed later. So a terrible situation for Europe. Inside Western Europe, what do we have? Troubles, troubles, and troubles. Destruction from the war, cities burned down, people killed. The United States of America and the Soviet Union have increased their influence over Europe dramatically. There are new political systems in several countries, mainly Germany, Austria, the losing countries, adopting democracy, but that was not an easy task after a dictatorship. It's never easy to switch a political system. And then there is distrust. There was distrust between old enemy countries, among them chief Germany and France. There was real hatred between people. People would not talk to each other. People would hate each other. So the situation, and of course I didn't mention that the economy was also very bad in those days. So the situation was really bad in the years after World War II. And here comes your task for next week. Imagine you are a European politician in 1950. You want to build a better future for your country. What should be done? 説明しますね。で、これは宿題ですね。じゃあ、来週まで、Eメールで、Weber に送ってください。で、タスクね。あなたはヨーロッパの政治家ですね。で、これ、シチュエーションは左側で書いてあるね。悪い、まずい、未来なさそうね。ない。で、もっといい国とか、もっといいヨーロッパを作りたいんですね。じゃあ、何ができるね。この悪いシチュエーションからスタートをして、どうやって、関係とかシチュエーションが、良くなることできるかな。What should be done ね。 じゃあ、ちょっとあなたのアイディア、英語でとか、ヨーロッパの言葉ね、フランス語、ドイツ語、スペイン語とかイタリア語とかもいいですよ。ヨーロッパの言葉で私の方に送ってください。Right. So that was it for today. History of Europe and the EU. Actually, the EU is more likely to feature in lecture number 3. Next week, please stay tuned on YouTube, and thank you very much for staying until the end. お疲れ様でした。Goodbye.